Today, we're going to talk about one of the largest specialization areas in contemporary anthropology, medical anthropology. And I'll warn you, the following lecture may seriously impact your health, but I'm hoping in a good way. You see, once you start thinking about health from an anthropology point of view, things like illness, germs, and hospitals, they'll never look the same again. Take magical death, for example. You ever worry about that? It's kind of scary, and I assure you it's real. Basically, it's a condition in which your thoughts can kill. Seriously. It's called the nocebo effect. The word nocebo, it comes from a Latin word meaning to harm, and the nocebo effect is the opposite of the placebo effect, which maybe more of you are familiar with. Now, researchers who study the nocebo effect essentially look at the various ways that our thoughts, just our thoughts, can harm us. And it turns out that the power of negative thoughts can not only make you sick, it can actually kill you. Now, this is the phenomenon we call magical death. Take the 18th century story from a Vienna medical school. It was here that a crew of students pulled what became a tragic prank. You see, they bound up a bothersome peer and blindfolded him, and he struggled to break free. The group explained that they were going to cut off his head. So, with his head on a chopping block, the pranksters, they grabbed a wet cloth and dropped it on the poor guy's neck. And the moment it hit his skin, the young man died on the spot. You see, his brain, the power of his expectations and thoughts, well, they ostensibly transformed that wet cloth into a razor-sharp blade. And there are similar stories like this across cultural traditions. This nocebo effect, it's real. So let's start with that to begin our exploration into medical anthropology. Here's a more recent and scientifically documented study that shows the sheer power of thought on human health. In this nocebo study, patients were given sugar water and told that it would induce vomiting. What do you think happened? How many of those people do you think actually threw up? Maybe 10%? Maybe it was as high as 25%. Would you believe that a full 80%, a clear majority, vomited upon drinking that sugar water? I mean, the power of the brain and what we think can definitely impact our biological health. So we'd do well to understand what's going on with this body-mind connection. That's one of the reasons medical anthropology emerged in the first place. Doctors and other health professionals, long aware of the placebo and nocebo effect, increasingly recognized that illness and health, they're not exclusively biological. And because anthropologists are equally at home with biology and culture, anthropology emerged as a great way to think about medicine and health beyond, yet inclusive of, our biology. So, the big picture, the central ethos of medical anthropology is inspired by one general idea. That is, that human health, good and bad, is much more than biology. But what do we do with that? Well, take malaria, for example. About half the world's population is vulnerable to suffer from malaria. Now, despite great progress and new medications in recent years, hundreds of thousands of people die of malaria every year, and millions more suffer through it. And as someone who's had it over a half a dozen times, I can tell you, malaria can be horrible. Every year in my project communities in Mali, we do our best, but we witness malaria deaths, particularly in elderly and infant populations. It's a disease that not only kills people, but it also drains households of the critical labor they need to keep bellies full throughout the year. And getting malaria, experiencing it, treating it, they're all shaped by sociocultural, political, and environmental factors. It's bigger than sheer biology. Malaria is caused by certain blood parasites that are carried and transmitted by mosquitoes. So having malaria is definitely a biological event. Let's not forget that. But it's so much more than that. Let's work this out with a brief history of why only half the world's population has to worry about this disease. Malaria You may be surprised to learn, well, it used to be a major public health issue right here in the United States. Historical sources and government data, they're clear about that. Prior to the mid-20th century, malaria, it crippled the nation's labor force and military. Right here in North America, our workforce was regularly hampered by this pervasive disease. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Tennessee Valley Authority into law, malaria affected almost a third of the Tennessee River Valley population. It was like the common cold, except this one knocks you out of the workforce for longer. In fact, as we've heard, it can kill you. Now, similarly, with the world wars and the collection of U.S. territories around the world, the U.S. military also reeled from malaria. In World War II alone, sources estimate that we lost somewhere around 60,000 U.S. soldiers who died not from bullets, but from malaria. In the 1940s, the military, they enacted the Malaria Control in War Areas program, which a few years later was transformed into the Communicable Disease Center, or what we now call the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control. The short of it was that the U.S. brought home its military efforts to combat malaria. And the CDC, it brought malaria eradication not only to U.S. military bases in the South, but to the general public as well. Ultimately, these efforts established the CDC as a national malaria eradication agency. And despite the prevalence of malaria in the world today, the U.S. did wipe out malaria on its own soil. If you contract malaria as an American citizen today, it's because you picked it up somewhere else. Now, the initial campaign was nothing short of remarkable. With the widespread application of DDT, the CDC partnered with state and local health agencies in 13 different states. And starting in 1947, they commenced spraying millions of homes with stunning results. In less than 5 years, the CDC completed its job. Malaria and reports of malaria infections, they were eliminated from our shores. So following this success, the CDC, it expanded its mission to incorporate both domestic and international programs. And they now work on all diseases, including everything from, say, hepatitis to Ebola. So most Americans will never experience malaria in their lifetimes. But the point of all of this is that the eradication of the disease in the U.S., it was not a question of human biology at work. Without the collective action and organized campaigns of the 1940s, malaria would still be endemic in the United States. Rather than biological adaptations or vaccines, it's the economy and the political history of the United States that wiped malaria out. But it's not only one's exposure to malaria that is bigger than biology. It's also the malaria experience and treatment as well. It all transcends sheer biology. That is to say that if you catch malaria today, there are great medicines out there. But socioeconomics make it so that the majority of Africans who get malaria have trouble accessing these drugs. So from how you get a disease to how you treat it and how you experience and understand an ailment, in medicine and health, there's way more than biology at work. Anthropologists, as we've described them in just about every one of our lectures, are bridge builders. They connect people and cultures across cultural, linguistic, and just about any other human divide. And in the case of medical anthropologists, they build their bridges to connect biology and culture. One of my favorite examples of medical anthropology in action is a curiously titled piece by Cheryl Mattingly called Pocahontas Goes to the Clinic. Rather than seeking exotic cultures from the other side of the globe, Mattingly takes her medical anthropology to the clinic, to the modern hospital, just like the ones near your hometown. And anyone who spent any amount of time in a hospital knows that Mattingly is spot on when she describes it as a cultural border zone. I mean, whether we're talking about patients, families, doctors, nurses, or anyone else in that zone, we see all kinds of human diversity in terms of language, religion, ethnicity, gender, age, economics, and so much more. When I was hospitalized following a trip to Ghana, West Africa, I remember being astonished to wake up at George Washington University Hospital only to find a Ghanaian nurse attending to me. It turned out she was from the town I had just left a few days before in Africa. The clinic is indeed a border zone, and that's terrific, but there's something potentially menacing amongst all that diversity. Namely, we're talking about the potential for misunderstanding. Misunderstandings that could mean life and death, or at the very least, discomfort versus excruciating pain. Well, Mattingly went to her field site, the clinic, the way I went to my partner villages in West Africa. And her work shows us that biomedicine is most effective when it's paired with cultural understanding and competence. In her study, she reveals how cultural misunderstanding undermines the quest for positive health outcomes. One of her examples involves sickle cell anemia patients, particularly Black teen males. Mattingly documented how Black teen males with sickle cell anemia are often mislabeled as med seekers. You see, sickle cell is a painful inherited blood disease that leads to sudden attacks of very severe pain, and it comes on without warning. And the pain, it's so disabling that hospitalization becomes a regular aspect of living with this condition. What scares most parents of sickle cell children is that in addition to crippling pain, this condition can also cause major organ damage, including brain damage. So with regular hospital visits for pain treatment, the sociocultural context of being a Black teenager in the United States carries the additional burden of being labeled a troublesome med seeker when in fact, these kids need medical treatment. One of the best vignettes from Mattingly's study actually featured Spider-Man, not Pocahontas. Think about it. Depending on your cultural, religious, or even linguistic background, talking with doctors, it can be unnerving. I mean, what if you were an elder born to a religion and culture that made it inappropriate to discuss sexual or even digestive issues with younger people or people of the opposite biological sex? Now, without compromising my spiritual life, how do I speak to that kind young female doctor about what's really going on with my body? I mean, I can use euphemisms perhaps, but that's only going to cloud the picture that my doctor needs to see. Mattingly, she shows how an anthropologically minded physician can work to understand and identify these precarious, yet fairly easy to resolve situations. Now, this doesn't have to involve faraway cultures. It might involve understanding differences between adult culture and children's culture. In one case, for example, Mattingly describes a boy who, for whatever reasons, was neutralized by fear of medical personnel and equipment. And that happens to all of us. Many of us get super nervous in the clinic, even when we share a language and cultural background with our providers. Health professionals who administer blood pressure tests, they explain this white coat syndrome when patients are shocked to see their blood pressure numbers in the clinic are significantly higher than when they just did the tests at home. For many of us, simply the presence of a white coat and a medical test is enough to increase our blood pressure. Now, Mattingly explains, doctors needed to test the boy's mobility to properly diagnose and treat him, but he was non-responsive. Well, Mattingly goes on and says that as soon as the attending physician found a common cultural frame through which to relate to this boy, everything changed. The short of it is this, that they assuaged the boy's fears and turned him into a super compliant patient by talking some Spider-Man. Now, when the medical procedures were translated into superhero tests aimed at helping young Spider-Man and his crime-fighting ambitions, the boy leaped into action. Now, it sounds like a simple solution once we hear this after the fact, but it's critical to note that adequate biomedical treatment was made possible only after the boy jumped out of his shy demeanor. And that happened only because the physician built a cross-cultural bridge of understanding. What Mattingly shows us with a few of these vignettes is that equal to technical prowess, we also need health professionals with strong cross-cultural skills. And that fact is not lost on the medical profession at large. Standardized testing for nursing, right? For nursing certification even, it now includes anthropological content. The nursing program at my university now pushes students into anthropology courses, and they've even made anthropology a major component for our health studies minor. Anthropology clearly has a mission in the world of medicine. So now that we have a better idea of this mission, let's take a closer look at how medical anthropologists break down the phenomena of sickness and health. How does our view of illness and health change when we see them as anthropologists? Well, linguistically, we find that the word ill derives from an Old Norse word meaning wicked or morally evil. Now, these connotations of wickedness indicate that prior to our modern understanding of pathology, we attributed illness to evil or malevolent forces, perhaps supernatural forces. But that old sense of the term is far from how medical anthropologists understand illness today. Simply put, in medical anthropology, we define illness as a cultural experience. For example, I'm a diabetic, but illness is not diabetes. Illness is my subjective experience as a diabetic. Arthur Kleinman, a foundational figure in medical anthropology, tells us that illness is an individual's culture-bound understanding of the event. And as a physician and anthropologist, he should know. From his dual post at Harvard as professor of medical anthropology and professor of psychiatry, Kleinman has inspired scores of students, some of whom have become medical anthropology giants in their own right. But in terms of medical anthropology, we don't conflate disease and illness. It's our business to separate the subjective experience of illness from the biological phenomenon of disease. But why? Well, treating a disease is not the same as treating an illness. For the disease, I need my physician to fix what's going on in my body. But I'll also need someone to help me fix what's going on in my head, my subjective experience. One may think that the disease-illness distinction is pedantic, but if your illness, your subjective symptoms, if they don't fit into the objective disease framework taught in medical schools, then you can't receive adequate treatment. Disease, according to Kleinman, is the biological event regardless of the cultural context. So disease, it's not culture-bound, but illness is. And that's why our health requires more than prescriptions and surgery. We tend to focus so much on the disease, we often neglect the person. And that's significant because we seldom pay enough attention to the vastly different ways we humans subjectively experience critical health events like disease. Take diabetes in the US versus Mali. It's the same disease. It's all about blood glucose levels, period. However, being a rural Malian diabetic is quite different from having this condition in the US. Namely, in rural Mali, you may not even be diagnosed as a diabetic. You might not even get tested for diabetes because your illness, your subjective health experience, could be very likely attributed to some other condition. But even if you do get diagnosed, the kind of treatment we'd want for our children, insulin, blood testing, special diet, etc., well, in the village, that treatment plan, it presents a number of complications. First, there's economics. Many families in my host community have to scrape by to buy a single dose of antibiotics, let alone a recurring expense for insulin injections. But even if the medicine supplies, the test kits, even if they're made affordable, there's no refrigeration or electricity for that insulin. So while diabetes as a biological event is the same disease no matter where you go, nevertheless, the experience of having this condition may differ from one person to the next and from one culture to the next. So illness, culture-bound; disease, not culture-bound. But what about health? Sometimes it's useful to define things by describing what they're not, but this isn't the case for health. To understand health as simply the absence of sickness, that doesn't do health and healing justice. The Old English root for health is more on the mark. It refers to wholeness and being whole. But like illness, being whole doesn't look the same for everyone, everywhere. Across cultures, wholeness or health includes multiple dimensions. There's physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual health. And we measure our health in different ways. Sometimes we think of health as feeling good, or sometimes it's simply the absence of disease, right? But other times we feel healthy as a consequence of living in harmony with our own subjective morality. Now, that's all a bit too loose for our practical purposes because as anthropologists, we need a precise yet inclusive definition of health. And luckily, we don't have to look too far to find one. Now, the WHO, the World Health Organization, they define health as, quote, complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And they add that it also involves the capability to function in the face of changing circumstances. The WHO also strives to promote the highest possible level of health so that people can live a, quote, socially and economically productive life. Now, the WHO's definition of health clearly goes beyond mere biology. And this anthropological perspective, it's no coincidence. Medical anthropologists play a host of roles in the WHO and in related institutions throughout the world. For example, my former mentor, Peter Brown at Emory University, he serves on the WHO Advisory Committee on Malaria. And speaking of actual medical anthropologists and what they do, in this final segment of our lecture, let's take a quick look at two classic medical anthropology case studies. One of my favorite medical anthropology studies is a 1993 study by Byron J. Good and Mary Jo Del Vecchio Good. Like anthropologists bustling off to a remote fishing village in the Pacific, the Good studied the peculiar culture of first-year students at Harvard Medical School. They used anthropology to peer into the minds of actual medical students as med school transforms their understanding of the human body from mystery to mechanics. One of the more remarkable sections of this study described the close and rather tender relationships that many medical students develop with their first cadavers and sometimes even their surviving families. You see, after spending hours and hours with the cadaver, the students begin to realize that the person who provided it, the deceased, their selfless gift is what opened the path to becoming a practicing physician. And the magnitude of this gift, it's not lost on these medical students. Another great observation from the Good study is that as medical students go through their first year or so in med school, the experience literally changes the way the aspiring physicians see the body. By breaking down the body into its constituent systems and parts, the lab and lectures eventually render the complexity of the human body into a machine with working parts. And for anyone who has ever contemplated or even finished the arduous med school path, this study is a terrific inside glance into how doctors are made. Now, a second classic medical anthropology case study comes to us from anthropologist Emily Martin. In her 1994 book, Flexible Bodies, Martin delves deep into the collective American psyche to learn about how us non-physicians understand the immune system. Martin, she did a comprehensive field study rooted in the anthropological tradition. She did participant observation at 3 sites. She worked at an immunology lab, she volunteered at a house for HIV-positive individuals, and she also worked as an AIDS activist. And in all, she did some 200 interviews along with untold pages of field notes from her day-to-day observations. Now, again, her primary research question was, how do regular people understand the immune system? From the days of polio to the age of AIDS, Martin shows us that the metaphors we casually throw around, well, they reveal a lot about how we understand our immune system. Specifically, she showed that in the United States, militarism is a common metaphor for medicine and treating disease. We fight cavities and we battle cancer, right? I mean, my favorite commercial growing up, I remember it. It featured this nasty crew of cavity creeps. That's what they were called. And the only way to keep them from destroying your teeth with microscopic sledgehammers was to call the crest team and to fight a minty battle and brush them right away. Now, it was basically a 30-second cartoon version of that awesome 1966 Hollywood gem, Fantastic Voyage. And if you've seen this one, you're probably smiling a bit. In this sci-fi adventure, a group of American scientists, they jump into a nuclear submarine, which is then zapped and shrunk down to the size of a blood cell. Now, the submarine team then gets injected into the scientist's body where they evade antibodies and other dangers on their mission to save this scientist's life. Ultimately, Emily Martin's study shows that in the US, we're shifting from militaristic, fortress-based metaphors for the body and health, and instead, from the age of AIDS onward, she sees our metaphor changing into one of dynamism and flexibility. And as we enter the 21st century, Martin says Americans, we're no longer focusing on the idea of an immune system as a battle-ready army of white blood cells. Rather, we're coming to see and value adaptability in our immune system. And this conceptual shift, this new focus on flexibility, has broader cultural ramifications, including an openness to new ways of treating disease and maintaining our health. Pioneering field researcher Audrey Richards, she presaged the value of medical anthropology with her nutritional studies that merged qualitative and quantitative field data in the early 1900s. And by the late 20th century, as we can see in the work of Martin and the Goods, medical anthropology had come of age. Now, early scholars, they focused on the idea of ethnoscience or folk medicine. And among those early medical anthropologists, there was a consensus that biomedicine, otherwise known as Western medicine, well, it was essential to boost so-called lesser developing nations. And that global project, it provided fertile ground from which medical anthropology blossomed. Later, in the 20th century, medical anthropology followed the currents we saw in cultural anthropology with new interests in psychology, meaning, and symbolism. And as the century pushed on, so did the idea that non-Western medical practices, that is, those outside conventional biomedicine, were well worth understanding from within rather than through a Western or scientific lens. And ever since, medical anthropology has become one of the largest and most prolific subsections of the American Anthropological Association. Contemporary medical anthropology is a definitive example of applied anthropology. From an interdisciplinary, four-field approach, medical anthropologists chart the depths of the biology-culture nexus of human health and healing. And it's exciting to imagine how medical anthropology will continue to flourish as new technologies and discoveries reveal more and more about how to foster our physical, emotional, and spiritual health.